Welcome to today's class. Well, as I had told you in my last lecture, I would from today concentrate on Edward Said. But as I had also told you that before I do that, I would like to connect and contextualize three things: postcolonialism, postcolonial criticism, and postcolonial theory. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about, as I have already done to some extent, is postcolonialism. Now, as one of you had asked me during my last lecture, is postcolonialism to be dated from the period after the independence of the erstwhile colonies, or is it to be dated from the point of encounter between the colonizers and the colonized, when colonization took place? Not in one place, but in many places all over the globe. But you know, even though this colonization process did not materialize in all places at one time, we can reasonably say that there was a period, and the process has to be dated from the beginning to the end of the process of colonization, the fact of colonization. Because behind this process, there was one specific ideological factor. What was that? The perception of the East as something other, something inferior, other to the West, as well as inferior to the West. Okay? So from the perspective of the East, therefore, again, the difference was in the perception, because perception is always determined by perspective. I perceive you in a particular way because of my own subject position, my own place in the hierarchy of power. You also do the same about me. You also perceive me based on your subject position. So if the West perceived the East also perceived the West. These two perceptions were, in many cases, different. The East was perceived as inferior. The West perceived itself as superior. And because of the unequal power situation, because the West has been historically more dominant of the two, the perception of the West held sway. Often it was imposed upon the East, and sometimes the Easterners also internalized it. Now, dear friends, when you read Louis Althusser, you will read about two things, among many others. RSA or repressive state apparatuses and ISAs or ideological state apparatuses. You know, when I control you or you control me, when the West controlled East, some extent of the control was due to the military superiority of the West. Better weapons, better tactics, better soldiers, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, some extent of this domination was also ideological. I have already told you how the West sent its messengers of peace and well-being through the missionaries, the Christian evangelists who tried to spread Christianity, sometimes through inducements, sometimes through social work, sometimes through forceful means. Similarly, the West introduced certain ideas. A so-called idea of the rule of law, the idea of democracy, the idea of legislature, the idea of Western education. And through these means, the Westerners intended and in many cases succeeded, intended to and succeeded in their project of controlling the minds of the Easterners. Okay. When the Westerners learned any Eastern language, they used it for control. And when the Easterners learned English or any Western language, they often did it to kowtow. They wanted to ingratiate themselves with their colonial masters. This is something we have to understand. Now, post-colonialism, therefore, tries to shift the balance, tries to ride back to the center. Now, it is the margin, it is the empire which is trying to ride back, think back, argue back to the center, through the mother country. Now, what about post-colonial criticism and post-colonial theory? First thing we have to understand is that we are students of literature. We are students of culture. We are students of humanity or the humanities. So obviously, we are going to talk about representation. We are going to talk about representation. We are going to talk about expression, about texts, authors, trends, canons, and so on and so forth. And we are also going to talk about conventions. Because as students of English literature, we have been influenced by the Western traditions, the erstwhile colonizers' speech, and as a result, we have often been vilified by critics and writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, about whom Professor Benjamin Coleman was speaking the other day. And some of you were there, but not many. Even though I had exhorted you to be there, not many of you had taken the hint. Okay, coming back. So when we think about post-colonial criticism and post-colonial theory, we know that theory refers to the general principles, where criticism refers to the act of reading, even though any watertight compartmentalization between the two is neither possible nor desirable. So obviously we have to understand that post-colonial criticism and post-colonial theory that are subsumed by post-colonial studies along with post-colonialism per se. Post-colonial studies has its perspectival basis in the counter discourse that the empire, that the East, that the global South feels it necessary to adopt to the Western canon of literature, of history, of philosophy, of medicine, and so on and so forth, as also the Eastern or the canon of the colonized peoples. So it's a fresh perspective. Now, having said this, I have to give you a necessary statutory warning that many of the critics are nowadays trying to give post-colonial studies its death sentence. Because according to them, post-colonial studies, though necessary and profitable in its day, has long lost its relevance. Today, in the day of neo-colonialism, in the day of globalization, and so on and so forth. But my humble opinion in this context will be that before we consign post-colonial studies to the dusty shelves of a disused library, we have to think about its necessity, its relevance. And as students of the postgraduate course over here, the Department of English, University of Gourbanga, Malda, West Bengal, India, Asia. I am deliberately choosing these place names because we belong to the margin. When you will read of Mimicry and Man, and when you will read some of you, I'm hopeful, will take the trouble to read it. If and when you read The Location of Culture, the book from which of Mimicry and Man by Homi K. Bhabha has been taken, you will see that location is also very, very important. And the place, the role, the significance of the place is not an unproblematic one. Yes, Said did start the movement in some ways, but Bhabha went on to explore the nuances, the complications. I'll come to that as I go along. Coming back, we have to understand that post-colonial studies, post-colonial criticism, post-colonial theory tries to utilize the insights gained from the post-colonial perspective and utilizes them to further the understanding of the process and project of representation that the colonial encounter necessarily occasioned. It's a pity that we cannot go on discussing the background to post-colonial theory to any large extent, because we are hemmed in by time and the problems of the semester system. We have to move on. So today I will give you a thumbnail sketch of Edward W. Said, a Palestinian-American writer, critic, academician, public intellectual, piano player, and whatnot. Said was born in 1935 and died in 2003. He was a US citizen. Thanks to his father, a US Army veteran. And because of his Arab roots and Christian religion, Christian background, and his US citizenship and exposure to the Western education from his very childhood. You know, Edward Said has been both valorized and vilified as the Edward Said was a professor of history, of literature, a keen student of history. And in 1977, he wrote a book that in the field of representation, in the field of cultural and literary studies had a comparable impact as did, say, Freud's interpretation of dreams, or even Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selections. Now, I will obviously talk about Orientalism. And I will read with you the introduction to Orientalism. But before I do that, I need to tell you something about the excellent preface that sets the argumentative ball rolling, as they say. The excellent preface to Orientalism. Please read it. You know, in 2003, a Silver Jubilee edition was brought out containing an afterword as well. Because from the immediate context of the Arab-Israeli war that inspired Edward Said to write Orientalism in 1977, the immediate context of the Silver Jubilee edition in 2003 was actually the 9/11 attacks and the consequent and subsequent war on terror. So if you really want to make sense of postcolonial studies, if you really want to make sense of Orientalism, if you really want to make sense of Edward Said, my dear friends, you will have to know little bit of history, a smattering of history, both ancient and contemporary. Because the encounter between the West and the East did not begin in the 15th, 16th or 17th century. It began long, long back through trade and commerce, through military aggression, through the Crusades even. The East and the West came into contact with one another, with each other from a very, very ancient times. But you know, there is one particular thing that we need to keep in mind in this context. That the large-scale settlement of vast regions of the non-European land was a Renaissance and post-Renaissance affair. This is something that I never tire of stressing in such classes as this. You know, Orientalism as a word, as a marker, comes from the word Orient. You remember my deciphering of the word postcolonialism? The Orientalism comes from the Orient. My dear friends, as I was telling you, Orientalism comes from the word Orient. Orient means East. Oriental means of or relating to characteristic of the Orient. Ism means a particular system of arguments that believes in the existence of the Orient and certain characteristics that are peculiar to the Orient. Yes or no? Is it clear to all of you?
Yes, sir.
But now you tell me, Orient means the East. East to what? East to what?
West.
East to the West. That means Europe. So east of Europe. So Europe is considering itself as the center. Where from comes the word Eurocentrism, the concept of Eurocentrism. Yes? Now I am telling you, just as Edward Said had taught us, that Orientalism, these are basically vague ideas. These are relative ideas. Because there was now no place called the East. It was a discursive construction of and from the West. What do I mean? I mean that there were various places. There were various places like India, China, Japan, Korea, and so on and so forth. Just as there were European places like England, like Italy, even though in those days Italy was actually divided into different cities, you know, Venice, Padua, Florence, and so on and so forth, Rome. So I am trying to point out that there were no political entity. There are no political entity and even a historical entity called the East or the West. It was basically a construction of the West. Why should you construct this kind of a special idea? In order to generalize. So the East was discursively constructed by the West in order to be generalized. So the East had to be generalized as something different from and inferior to the West. So Orientalism came hand in hand with Occidentalism. The two constructions must have been coeval, coterminous, simultaneous, operating at one and the same time. As different from and yet dependent upon one another, each other for existence. So if the East had to be created, the West had to be created. And vice versa. Are you getting my point? Are you getting my point? So in the eventuality of domination, what the West needed to do was to construct a particular way of representation. The representation of the East and the Easterners. Just think about it. East was fascinating. East was flummoxing. It was dangerous. It was luxurious. It was full of gold and wealth. And it was also full of danger and threat. It was full of diseases. And it was full of possibilities. So think about it. This kind of an everlasting paradox accompanied the construction of the East by the West. Why had the East to be constructed in this particular way, as different from and inferior to the West? In order to justify any kind of plunder, any kind of brutal treatment, and even political, military, as well as ideological control over this vast area of the world, along with its inhabitants. Are you getting my point? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
So from the next day onwards, we are going to read Orientalism. And we will have to take the help of the text as well. Okay?
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay. Is there any question, any comment by any one of you? I have told you to participate. Any relevant query is always welcome.
Sir, Occidentalism and Orientalism, are they opposite, but are they kind of parallel in their conditions?
See, the problem is, this is what I have been discussing, my dear friend. You have to understand this. Now, if I say that there is a particular Orient, a particular place called Orient, and there are certain characteristics, certain features that are peculiar to the East. So where from am I talking? I must be talking from outside, from somewhere else, not from the East. Yes or no? Is this much clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes or no? Okay. So I am talking from the Occident, from the standpoint of the Occidentals. So if I am doing that, when I am trying to, or when we are trying to characterize the East in a particular way, we have to categorize and characterize ourselves in a different and equally particular way. Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes,
have you
sir.
understood this much? So obviously they are coexisting. They are coexistent. They exist and operate simultaneously. Any other question?
Sir, does Orientalism set forth that as East as self and the as West as the self and the East as the others?
Yes, of course. Of course. Because Orientalism is a construction, a discursive construction of and from the West. So who is perceiving the East? The Westerners. So obviously, they being the perceivers will consider themselves as the self. And because the East and the Easterners are different from and inferior to them in their perception at least. So obviously the East will be treated as the other, as different and inferior. Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other question? Okay, Shamim, if there are no other questions, we can call it a day now.